to this conference. Africa Beyond 2015, the future of gender studies, research and service. And we are looking particularly at advancing women in leadership, at institutional building, and of course, we are looking at partnerships, collaborations. As we all know, 2015 is a big year. A big year in the sense that that's when we are supposed to have achieved so many Millennium Development Goals. And of course, in those goals, education is one of them. Education for the girl child. And one of them is gender equality. This particular conference, we are actually assessing ourselves as women and gender studies. We are reflecting, we are projecting on the future of women, feminists, and gender studies. And this particular conference was realized to address a number of issues. But addressing those issues, we had a basis. And the basis goes back to the School of Women and Gender Studies for the past 20 plus years. We know the school started in 91, and very soon we are going to have 25 years. And 25 years, our guest of honor, there are so many things that we have achieved. And those we have achieved has actually put us in a unique position globally in gender and feminist studies. And this has led to regional, national demands to expand women and gender studies. And this expansion does not only look within the country, but outside Uganda as well. We need to create synergies. We need to come together and see how to address these issues. And so we need now to look at our experiences as gender units, as women studies units, and see what challenges do we have, what best practices do we have in the area of research, in the area of service to the community, and advancing women. What do we have in there? What best practices do we have? How can we create a bigger picture than having a School of Women and Gender Studies at Makerere University being the talk of the whole continent? How can we spread out our wings? And so for that matter, we chose the three themes: advancing women in leadership, why advancing women in leadership. Women in leadership are the ones going to ensure that nations develop. And if we do not do that, women and men and children, they are going to stay behind. And of course, we are looking at institutional building. Institutional building is very crucial, guest of honor, because in institutional building, that's where we set the stage. That's where we open ourselves to other units, to other universities, to other countries. In institutional building, this is where we have frameworks, we have legal legislations to ensure that programs continue, to ensure that units that we start grow to capacity. And so for us, we are saying, how can we progress? How can women's studies develop sustainably? How are universities promoting that? What are the existing challenges that maybe universities are facing to make sure that these programs, these units are sustainable? I would like to say that in these 3 days, we are going to have a big discussion. We are going to listen to each other, to talk to each other. And as we listen, as we talk, we need to see how can we move forward. What is it going to take for us to say that after 2015, we are going to have strong academic programs of women and gender studies globally? And that is all we want to know. How can we do that? If it means that we develop networks, we are going to do that. And those networks will help each other to move forward. And I would like to recognize the contributions of Makerere University for accepting to host this conference.
We expect collaborations and partnerships to emanate from here today. And this is only 3 days. Let's have a start of collaborations. We have held many conferences in Uganda, but the outputs of these conferences sometimes is not good. So please, this word collaboration, the word partnership, let's experience it. Let us take it to a step further. And me personally, as the Dean of Sports Psychology, representing the principal, would be excited if we form partnerships, collaborations, especially between the southern partners, facilitated by our northern colleagues. Yes, and you know that collaborations will lead to research and publications. Yes, and in the end, shall realize development, as the Dean has emphasized. Dear Vice Chancellor, Professor Gumba Sentam, you are welcome. God bless us. Thank you.
As you are aware, Makerere University was established in 1922 with a motto, "Let us be men." That was the motto of Makerere University in 1922, "Let us be men." This was done accommodating to aspiring female students, and indeed it was against human rights. However, over time, this has changed. Makerere University is now admitting female students and has tried our best to mainstream gender in university structures. This conference is timely and it comes at a crucial time when Makerere University is structuring our programs. In my view, this conference gives us an opportunity to demonstrate the importance and relevancy of gender and women's studies in our country. At the same time, it also gives us an opportunity to examine what we are offering in gender and women's studies. Let us not be offended by those who are criticizing gender and women's studies. But on the contrary, let us invite them and have a dialogue with them on this important display. Let us use this conference to share best practices, lessons learned, and challenges being faced in stimulating and creating sustainable collaborations in gender studies. I know this conference will come up with a way forward that will contribute to improving women and gender studies As we prepare to share experiences on the conference themes and discuss the direction of gender studies as an academic discipline, I would like us to refresh ourselves about the School of Women and Gender Studies at Makerere University. The School of Women and Gender Studies initiated the process of gender mainstreaming in the university. The process resulted into the establishment of the Directorate of Gender Mainstreaming in 2000. Indeed, the school has played a big role in contributing to the current status of Makerere University's gender responsiveness. Beyond Makerere University, the school is playing an integral role in gender-sensitive community development in Uganda and the other African nations. Members of staff from this school are consultants to African higher education institutions, exploring and expanding gender studies curriculum, career path, and international partnerships. That notwithstanding, we still have a lot of gender issues to address in this university. The university management, together with other various stakeholders, is ready to address these challenges. As you deliver throughout this conference, I would like to urge participants to come up with strategies of ensuring that women fully participate in leadership of institutions while learning. Let us develop strategies of strengthening women and gender studies in our institutions. Let us find ways and means of building women's movement and creating strong and sustainable networks. Once again, you are most welcome to this conference. And now it's now my pleasure and great honor to declare this workshop. Okay, I thank
you. As we are moving towards 2015, the Millennium Development Goals, which shaped and formed the international public policy framework from 2000 to 2015, we have seen, as was mentioned earlier on by the Dean, we have seen enormous developments across a range of sectors during this period. But now we're heading into the 2015 period, and there are much negotiations concerning what should follow. So before we get into the discussion or examination of what should follow, we need to examine what can be achieved, what has worked, and where the gaps are. And that's what I'm hoping we're going to talk a little bit about today. So looking at the evolution of gender mainstreaming in development practice in particular, looking at how gender has moved from the margins very much to the mainstream through the MDG process, and will remain mainstreamed following the MDG process and the Sustainable Development Goal period. Looking at some of the problems that this has given rise to, both in research and in practice, how the drivers of discrimination and the origins of inequality and really the dynamics of gender relations haven't really yet been tackled at a transformative level. We have seen a lot of tinkering, we've seen a lot of tailoring, but we haven't actually seen the type of transformation we would like to see and to achieve. And the question then is, how can we do this? What are the implications for gender-based research in particular? And how do we move beyond checklists, targets, goals, and headcounting to something which is far richer for women in their lives? So I suppose the focus on women in particular and women in development has been a focus of the international public policy framework since the 1940s. So it is not something new, it is not something different. Yet at the same time, when you look at the justifications for involving discussions and focus on women and gender, those justifications have ranged very much from evidence bases that women are good for development, that they will lead to better development outcomes, they will contribute to economic growth, they will contribute to better health outcomes, better educational outcomes. But probably from my perspective as a feminist, as a self-confessed feminist, from my perspective, the reason-based arguments as to why women should be included in this process are probably less developed. Now, it is a discussion which is very evident if we look at the World Development Report of 2012. They focus very much on the intrinsic reasons and justifications for focusing on women in particular as human beings of equal moral value. If we look at the post-2015 discussions and negotiations, I've drawn a quotation here from the UN High-Level Panel of Feminine Persons report, which was published in May 2013. And this report states that the next development agenda must ensure that in the future neither income nor gender nor ethnicity nor disability nor geography will determine whether people live or die, whether a mother can give birth safely, or whether her child has a fair chance in life. Now that prompted a question for me. How is this different from the outreach commitments? And what does it say about 20 years of gender mainstreaming following the strong introduction of gender mainstreaming at the Beijing Conference, the UN Conference for Women held in Beijing in 1995? So I've drawn now on the literature. There's a very strong debate within the literature on gender development looking at gender mainstreaming and what's the future for gender mainstreaming. And some have argued that gender mainstreaming has resulted in what they refer to as away streaming, as the attention has been driven away from focusing specifically on issues related to women to looking much more broadly and therefore diluting that focus. And also, very importantly, from a practice perspective, redirecting the financial supports that would have been available for women-specific projects. And we see this, and also then others have claimed there has been a reduction in the actual capacities of gender-based researchers and workers as they have had to focus on a number of different issues rather than focusing on women-specific issues. So if we look within the gender-based research space, a number of researchers have talked about the challenges that are available to organisations trying to identify what is the impact, how do we control for gender mainstreaming when we are actually evaluating projects. Because there are so many different things happening within projects, so how do we actually identify gender mainstreaming as a variable and actually test this to understand what the implications are? So women's priorities and perspectives are still missing from these key decision-making spaces. So two options then have been put forward, I think, in the literature. On the one hand, some have argued that we should look to move away from the term gender and back to the term women's studies. So if we look at the work of Cornell, Harrison and Whitehead, for example, they've argued that the term gender has neutralised the political content of the feminist struggles and has acted as a technical fix. Now, many of you will be very familiar with some of the technicalities around gender-based research, sex disaggregated data, the gender checklists that will be used in various development practice activities. She argues, and they argue, that this type of technocratic solution depoliticizes and de-radicalizes the feminist struggle, which essentially is about a redistribution of power. And they argue that gender and the term gender has fallen from favour and has a jaded and a dated feel to it. It's diluted, denatured, depoliticized. And an interesting side story, I had a meeting with colleagues in a higher education institution in Tanzania last year. And we were starting up a particular project on gender, and we had several discussions about different projects that we were working on together. Some of the projects were related to climate change, and some that we were going to talk about a project related to gender and gender perspectives within the institution. And a very good friend and colleague of mine stood up. He's a political scientist. He stood up, gender, okay, talking about women, time to leave the room. And after that, most men actually left the room. So I'd like to congratulate all of the men in this room today. It's wonderful to see you. So they've argued that making, so Carolyn Moser, for example, would argue that we need to look right across at different social identifiers, including sex, including age, including ethnicity, as well, and sexual orientation. And so we need to focus on gender. A focus on gender is much broader and richer than only a focus on women, because effectively a focus on women does exclude potential changes that are required from other groups within the community. And I've listed here, just refer to, if anyone is interested, I've referred to a number of researchers who've made this argument. So if we look at pathways to progress and we look at the post-2015 period, one of the first changes I think that needs to take place within the research space and within the research agenda is broadening that out. Rather than one of the problems with the Millennium Development Goal period has been a very, very narrow focus on individual specific goals. And one of the proposals, and also on headcounting. So where are we? How many people do we have in the classroom today? How many women are there in politics? Rather than looking at what's actually happening in that classroom, what actual policies are women influencing within those spaces? So one of the things that Carolyn Moser talks about is ensuring that we move away, that we do our headcounting, because it's very important, but we also then contribute and we enrich that with further qualitative research. So it's not to over-focus on the numbers, but to get beyond the heads into what's actually happening in those spaces. That's one of the first things that she talks about. And if we look at the work of Unterhalter, she's particularly important, I think, in the education development space. And again, she makes this point that we need to move beyond counting heads, get in underneath the door to find out what's actually happening in those spaces, and the best way in which you would do this, she talks about, is the intersectionality approach, which effectively is a gender research analytical framework that allows you to look across at different social identifiers to understand how they interact with one another in a particular space. Also then, in terms of practice, I think there seems to be quite a big push to focus on additional areas within that practice space, recognising how development and gender mainstreaming in the development space is cross-sectoral, multi-level, multi-scale. So one of the things that I think we'll probably see in the post-2015 period is a greater focus on gender dynamics within the household, looking at how gender dynamics are shaped and reinforced at the household level, and also how the different types of drivers of inequality that can arise in these spaces. Specifically, I think we're going to see targeted action on reduction and removal of violence as a method of social control, and then increased consideration of the division of gender, division of labour. What we're seeing in the formal economy, as the numbers of women grow in the formal economy, we are seeing again a very clear gender division of labour and the types of activities that women are engaging in, regardless of their skills, capabilities, and abilities. And then I think that there's a piece also that we're going to look at is, that we'll see consideration of within this space and within the goals, is how to look at issues related to the factors of development. So what are the factors of development? Access to land and resources, access to energies and access to finance. And I think within the policy space we will also see somewhat of a shift. We'll see a focus on goals in particular, but there will also be then an opportunity that focuses specifically on gender, and you see that we have discussion here about focusing in on all forms of discrimination, so explicit discrimination and implicit discrimination, violence, as well as a number of additional areas. And I think just to finish off, looking at the education space as a critical space in making these changes. When we talk about education, we're talking about teaching and we're talking about research. Research is about the formation of knowledge. How do we engage in that process through women's studies, through gender education and gender research centres. So recognising the role of education, I think, not just about the number of students who pass through our doors and sit in their seats, but far more important about the development of curriculum, the content of curriculum, and what is actually teaching and training our young girls and boys about the world, about themselves and their roles within that space. So transformation will require focusing on girls and boys, as well as different social identifiers, examining the curriculum and the assessments and the management, to enhance and support the individual child.
Desire of women first, and then the recognition that if women were to play more strategic roles in society, that society itself should provide the necessary education and training for the wider participation. Neither the decades of political and material turbulence, nor the birth of the women's rights movement alone, however, could generate the will for change within the traditional, male-dominated academic institution, which, by its very nature, would demand a departure from the traditions and the status quo. So the foregoing examination of context and events, therefore, supports the conclusion that was taken together. The events described above were necessary to provide the environment that made the innovation of establishing the Women's Studies Department among, if not the first in Africa, a viable possibility. Now, pivotal. Donor support. The timing of an actual startup of the department might have rested finally on the outcome of another post-war event. In July 1987, the university leadership invited the international donor community to explore ways the former prominent institution of learning might be rehabilitated and return again to its former glory. In attendance were leading donors, some having returned to Uganda when peace was restored. Among these were representatives of the British Council, USAID, the Ford Foundation, SOREC, Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and the European Union. Now, having set a pattern of taking the initiative to engage the social and political male power, ACFA are the leaders within the women's movement and academic leadership being represented, though not at the top of Makerele's centers of influence at the time. Nevertheless, we're determined to seize once again the opportunity to advance women. And having already begun to lobby for posts, including that of a Minister for Women, the social science faculty with the Association of University Women, and from the administration, combined efforts to secure the establishment of the Women's Studies Department. First, discussions were held with the committees responsible for planning that conference. Then, more specifically, within the social science faculty, the endorsement of the dean was sought and granted. And he became the intermediary, driving the force at the highest levels to ensure that a paper advocating the Women's Studies Department would be put on the historic agenda. A major outcome of the paper, which was made by the women who were both activists and academics, was an immediate and positive response from that select group. Significantly, the department set out a rationale for operationalizing the vision of Ugandan women to have access locally to university level education. The document attempted also to clearly state the interests and needs that would be addressed by the department, and in turn, the outcomes that would benefit the society as a whole. In summary, the response of these representatives was instant and profound. Those donors said to us who were meeting that the credibility of Makerere University's leadership and the seriousness it took, that is the donor community, in its role, the seriousness it took, Makerere, in its role to rebuild, would be assessed, measured, and judged by the priority it would give to the petition made by the women that day to establish Women's Studies Department as a priority. Judging by the priority it would give to the establishment of women's studies. Starting small but solidly, the women's proponents, mindful of how fragile the support among the majority of the male population was to greater equality for women in society as a whole, and the male domination in academia specifically, the proposal presented a structure that would not differ drastically from other departments prevailing at Makerere. For there was an awareness of the necessity to avoid or minimize the creation of resistance, rather than generate the support of male colleagues if the idea was to be advanced. And this is critical with regard to the subject of the paper, starting a Women's Studies Department. The proposal therefore called for launching a department that would be fully endorsed by university governance, structures such as its council, but rather than a program of activities being provided for by loose coalition of academic and support staff. Further, the proposed department should be at par with all other university departments. It was assumed that this would give its leadership a voice and visibility in all important fora. Potentially, departmental status would open the door for women in academia to advance on the basis of qualifications and merit rather than on the basis of female tokenism. The department structure would be enhanced and justified, secondly, by the introduction from the outset of relevant curricula and a strong emphasis on research. Thus, the university was petitioned to award initially the near highest degree, the master's, rather than the lowest, the diploma. It was argued that at that level, the department's initial first staff would set the direction and pace for further advancement. No more than 10 students needed to be admitted at the first intake. However, the physical space allocated to women should be strategically located, visible and permanent, no subletting. At the launching, there needed be no more than one room and one desk for the one staff person, and that person should hold a PhD and rank as a professor. Now, with the endorsement by the university leadership and the donor representation in July 1987, a major objective, fully supported by the women's movement of Uganda, was achieved: the advancement of higher education and training focused on women, which in time would drive subsequent activities supporting their wider goals: gender equality and equity. The host faculty, social science, took up the challenge of beginning the determination of course curricula and research agendas, as well as identifying experts to assist with academic startup, the development of courses, planning and securing funding resources. These tasks were ably spearheaded by the faculty and the first head of the Department of Women's Studies. Now, today, 30 years have passed. The Women's Studies Department was launched and has succeeded against all odds for that period when the idea was birthed. It is recognized that what has been presented in this statement as a way to start a Women's Studies Department draws on the unique experience of Uganda, and it is not represented perhaps by many of you here, but each listener will need to determine the relevance of what has been said, where she or he is in the local formation of a department or a school. There are surely lessons that you may learn from our story, and if the lessons are applied. It is hoped that when these lessons are identified during our discussions, the sharing will give birth to many other new, relevant women's studies departments, offsprings, springing up across Africa and beyond. Thank you.
Has been a subject of much debate for the past decade due to a number of reasons. And a number of studies were done in a bid to address gender imbalances which were and are still skewed in favor of men. Studies have also shown that most countries and institutions are still struggling to find lasting solutions to the current gender problems. To address the disparities, it is critically important for universities, governments, with the help of the corporate world, to establish degree programs, teaching and non-teaching departments, centers and schools that champion the promotion of gender equity and equality. There is need to increase the number of institutions that deal with gender issues so as to increase public awareness on gender issues. Literature search by the researcher, by the presenter, showed that there are very few centers, schools and departments that offer a wide range of gender-related programs. For example, in Zimbabwe, the only university that has a fully fledged school of gender and cultural studies is the Great Zimbabwe University. Other institutions such as the Midland State University, Africa University, offer compulsory modules to all their undergraduate students, which in my opinion is not enough to address all gender issues. Most institutions offer compulsory or optional gender-related modules, as opposed to having fully fledged departments which can offer a wide range of gender-related modules and programs. Ladies and gentlemen, education has proved to be a key part of strategies to improve individuals' well-being and society's economic and social development. Access to higher education has improved drastically over the past few decades in many disciplines, and there have been a number of encouraging trends in girls' and women's education. Enrollment is now in most countries, and in some cases, the gender gaps in enrollment have already disappeared, but there is very little that is being done to increase awareness on gender equality. The importance of education in dealing with gender biases has been emphasized by a number of international conventions, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 1994 International Conference on Population and Development, the Fourth World Conference on Women, held in Beijing in 1995, the Millennium Development Goals, which include goals for improved education, gender equality, and women's empowerment. The interaction between the contemporary gender systems and the conservative culture in which traditional gender roles are strongly enforced needs to be increased through introducing new degree programs in gender, departments in gender, and schools and faculties in gender. The first strategy is to promote comprehensive training, education, and human resource development policies and programs that are gender sensitive and involve academics, research, training and educational institutions, community-based organizations, and the private sector in establishing institutions. Then the second strategy is promote diversity in the education system, which in turn provides academic staff with adequate room to be creative and innovative. Facilitate and promote policy dialogue, both national and international, and the exchange of experience, expertise, know-how, and technology that recognize women. Develop national and local sources of revenue to finance the development of infrastructure and acquisition of state-of-the-art teaching learning equipment. Then the next strategy is making connections. Universities should enter into collaborations with other universities or the private sector with the aim of getting assistance in building institutions. E.g., we can have you can develop a memorandum of understanding. For instance, in Zimbabwe, we now have the School of Gender and Cultural Studies, and we can collaborate with the School of Women and Gender Studies at this university. So there is need for institutions to collaborate and work together so as to achieve their mandates. Then the next strategy is staff development. Staff development through studying for higher degrees, attending international conferences, etc. Then the next strategy, which is usually overlooked by most managers, is job satisfaction and motivation. It is important for management to ensure that employees are motivated to work and have a right attitude towards their work, management and workmates. For instance, if you want to establish a school which is offering gender-related programs, you really need the support of your employees. You really need the support of your subordinates. They can only support you if they are satisfied. They can only support you if they are motivated to work towards the setting up of the school. Then the other strategy is create a conducive environment where your members of staff can work in a free environment and share ideas with their executive, and share ideas with their leaders, and share ideas with their colleagues. And that way you can create a vibrant school. For instance, I can tell you that GZU's School of Gender and Cultural Studies is a vibrant school. The school is headed by a director who happens to be your former student, Mrs. Izogo. She's here. She's the director of the newly established school. The school has developed partnerships with a number of private institutions, such as Crimson Consultant Services, and we're getting a lot of assistance from our partners. Let me now look at the problems or the challenges which we faced when we were establishing the school. The first problem is stereotypes and resistance by some of the key stakeholders, such as traditional leaders and some few members in management. However, this we didn't have major challenges in going around the problem. Why? Because the Vice Chancellor fully supported the project. This was the VCC project. This is why he sent us here for a start visit, and this is why he also sent us to the University of Ghana for a start visit, and also sent us to a number of South African universities for a start visit. The other challenge which we faced is limited funding. I think you all know that when you are establishing a school or a department, you require funding to purchase state-of-the-art teaching equipment and also paying salaries and benefits to staff. For instance, when we started, we didn't have a building of our own, so what we had to do was to ensure that we have a state-of-the-art infrastructure for the school. The other challenge is that staff in schools and faculties that offer gender-related programs is still skewed in favor of men. For instance, our school is housed in the Faculty of Social Sciences. So you will note that most people who are in management, even in the School of Social Sciences, is skewed in favor of men. So that is. Let me now move on to the possible solutions. Crafting of curricula tailor-made to address gender-related challenges. So institutions must make an effort and not just offer a gender module, but create a curriculum which is tailor-made to address gender-related challenges. One module will not be able to address all gender-related problems. The next is promote research to solve gender-related problems. So it is important for institutions to promote research, to provide funding for research to solve gender-related problems. Then the next one is involving communities. For instance, in our case, when we were establishing the School of Gender and Cultural Studies, like I've already indicated that we faced a bit of resistance from traditional leaders. So we involved the traditional leaders and policymakers in as we were setting up the school. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what we have done at GCU in establishing the School of Gender and Cultural Studies. I thank you.
Curriculum was developed with the support of many people, including the Sussex University, and that the department depended a lot also on other supporters from the Commonwealth, CEDA, and then CEDA SAREC to support the curriculum. So the initial number of students that were recruited were 13, and with 5 core staff. That included also the head of department, who was Professor Marker. And the initial space was just the office, as Professor Maxine said. So all the staff, all the core staff, 5 staff, had only one office, which was the head of the department's office. And there was also a small library. If you are not seated with the head, then you will sit in the library with the students, because there was no more space. But she notes in her paper that that was okay, because we needed, the department needed to be established. Eventually the department was allocated a new house near the swimming pool, and to date we have a 3-level building as of 2002. I think it's one of the schools that has a full-fledged building with all the amenities and facilities. She also writes that there was quite a lot of arguments on what kind of program the women's department would run, and it was agreed it must be a master's course, not a BA and not a diploma. And this was basically because of the need and building on the 1985 Nairobi looking forward strategies that we needed to increase the resources. The women and men who are qualified in gender analysis and who are knowledgeable in issues of gender. So a master's level would be the most appropriate to start with, and have a number of people who could join the respective organizations. But also, I think core to it was the new scholarship for academic research, and also teaching was core to starting the department with a master's program. She says that this was very key to contributing to the knowledge in gender. I should mention at this point that we have in this room one of our first students, Dr. Henry Manila. You can stand, and they know you're the first student. Happy Tabitha, yes. Where are you, Tabitha? Okay, so those were the first students. And I remember very well as young people, young person who has just come back from Cambridge, having to teach some of the people you had been with at an undergraduate. But the courses were many, and I'll just mention a few of them. And many of them were focusing on women crime and deviation, gender, population and development, women in socio-economic and political systems. I also had a strong research methods and statistics, and a strong outreach. The students were going and did a lot of field work and field visits. There was also women in management, women in science and technology, and there was a lot of seminars and workshops to build the knowledge, but also to give the students a wide understanding of the issues that were pertinent in Uganda at that time. So many times the department drew on the other staff from other units and departments and even international community to build capacity of the local staff, but also to teach the subjects that we would not be able to teach. And with that, actually, the Fulbright scholars also joined the department. Cedar Sarek supported many of us to do PhDs. Commonwealth supported a lot of fellows to visit our department, to help us build our curricula, but also capacity building. Lastly, she talks about, about resource mobilization, which actually Maxine has talked about. It was very central. The Donors Conference. We believe if the Donors Conference was not held at that point, maybe the Department of Women and Gender Studies would have started at a much later stage. But the push from the donors helped a lot in the establishment of the department, of the school, and that it's very key that when you're pushing for the establishment of the departments, then you have resources to make sure it is effective and efficient. She briefly talks about the impact of the women and gender studies, according to her, on national public policy. I think Dr. Kawanisa talked about some of the successes. And a few things that are mentioned here are that actually the Department of Women's Gender Studies, women and gender studies, I know when it started it was women's studies. Now we have put up with women and gender studies. But she said a number of things have been achieved. Definitely in scholarship, that is one thing that the women and gender studies has actually, increased the understanding, research, and teaching in the discipline of gender. But that's because of our presence nationally, many organizations and international and so on. There are certain things that have now, taken root, like gender budgeting, gender auditing, affirmative action. All those, come in, along the establishment of women's studies and raising awareness of gender issues. The appointment of gender officers in the different ministries and districts, and many organizations are also have been recruiting gender specialists, and many of these are products of women and gender studies. And we know affirmative action is currently being reviewed. It has been adopted that's the 1.5 has been adopted in all the universities, but there's still a lot of discussions and debates about it. While Makerere we have achieved the 50-50, but we know that in sciences the numbers are still much lower.
Our colleagues in the civil society do not see us as really connected to the work that they do, because they mostly do activism, and it is a very big challenge. So the debate between feminism and gender as scholars is really very rife, and I think you touched on that point very well. But in Uganda, in our setup, I think we need both to thrive. At a certain level, you need activism so much, But if you're going to go to a rural woman who possibly doesn't even want to know what gender means from the start, but wants to be able to earn a shilling, to take a child to hospital, to pay fees, I think then what we call, I think, the depoliticized nature of this discourse comes in, and it produces very good results. People are talking about the naming of the school, and possibly, I think our colleague from Zimbabwe had the same problem, convincing the cultural leaders about the essence, the need, the importance of gender in a country like Zimbabwe, which is not so different from Uganda. I think the nomenclature is also as important as the content. I was scanning the room and I was seeing so many men strewn all over the conference room, and I think it is not a mistake. Imagine if at the title of the conference we had women in leadership, for instance, and you send an invite to a man who possibly doesn't warm up so much to gender issues, I do not think that these men would have been as many as we have in the room. So it is always very important to be strategic depending on the kind of objectives that you want to achieve at a certain point. And hence, when they asked Henry to stand up as the first student of a master's in women's studies, I think he had to ask a lot of questions among colleagues why he's doing a degree in women.
When you look at the theme, advancing women in leadership and all that, and also if you listen to all the presentations, how the department came up, how women's studies have been advanced, and when you look at the political will, for the case in Uganda, how it started, there was really very good political will that was really pushing and propelling some of these things. But right now, if you read through most of our newspapers, the pronouncements from our heads of states, it's like the political will is diminishing. And I don't know what impact this is going to have in our goal.
And so some of us realize that we're slipping back. And then there are others of us who, as 30 years ago, decided to take the bull by the horn and look at politics without being partisan. And the politics wanted today is that the activists and the academic must once again join forces. I repeat that in 1985, if there had not been women's movement, if people had not taken the challenge of the decade, McCary would have never even heard of women, least of all of gender. But it was activists and academics. And if you have shown in Uganda, in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, it may well be because you behaved the way men expected you to behave. But how many of us are activists and academics? Now, I have decided, and I told someone this morning, in 2 months I will be 81. I have decided to re-engineer myself one more time, and I'm going back into activism.
We should not pour panic on political statements. This is what is causing a problem. What you hear politically is not like a mean days. If you are here mean days, if you said it, you had to do it. But here you engage the head of state politically, which I think is willing to listen to you. So the management should do that. It took us a long time to work on this women and gender. There was a lot of engagement. And even to change it, we had to make a lot of engagement with whatever it is. In fact, at one time, we had suggested that gender, women and gender studies should be a course unit in all the disciplines in this university, so that there is no question about it. And then you can make it, if you want to go further on a postgraduate business. That's what we suggested, but we had to be there, and we left it to the new ones to come. I thought they would follow it up. But let us not panic on this.
The cross-cutting course to all undergraduate students in the university is being re-echoed in that engagement. It was made in 2010 during the review process. I think the issue we have to decide is whether to make it optional. There were several courses that were made cross-cutting, but units had options.
A number of us are facing challenges when it comes to what kind of output comes from our teaching, because it is good to produce as many gender scholars or many graduates from the study of gender. But what is the significance coming from the people that we are producing? And probably that also draws back to the newer establishments, like the one in the great University of Zimbabwe, because it seems to be that it's a smooth sail. There were not as many challenges in your experience as there were for us Ugandans. And so I want to challenge you probably to share with us what you feel about what might come out of your unit.
And we want to say that everyone in that community is talking about the positive element of gender. We are not being radical in our approach. We recognize that culture is there, but we are also saying, let us elevate the status of women, looking at a number of disadvantages which women have encountered, like when we have the domestic violence, when we have the sexual abuse, the rape against women, all that, and it's taking gender in a positive manner, not fighting.
As Ugandans, we must get drunk. We must radicalize. We must go beyond gender mainstreaming and move into activism. But what has always been my dilemma when I look at our status, at our activities as a School of Women and Gender Studies, and probably to share with others who are coming from other universities, is the question remains, how can academia intervene in easing this dilemma between, bridging the gap between the theoretical rights and the practice that seems to be there?
Professor Murphy, is that, okay, said you are mainly in the science field. So my question is, is it mainstream gender in the science-based fields? Thank you very much.
I'm not suggesting that we move away entirely from using and relying and conducting quantitative analysis, not at all. But what I am saying we can look at is looking at panel data, for example, or conducting longitudinal research projects that will allow us to actually follow experiences and to trace transformations as they occur over time. That then done in parallel with qualitative research, I think will produce a much richer data set for researchers to work on, to actually examine outcomes and impact over time rather than in an immediate sense year to year. The question that was raised in relation to bridging the gap between theoretical rights and practice, I mean, it's a brilliant question, absolutely brilliant question. And if I knew the answer, you know, I certainly probably, I don't know where I would be or what I would be doing, but I don't think there is a single answer to that. I think one of that's a particular space that I find myself, I spend most of my time thinking about this, right? Because on the one hand, I'm a political theorist, so I started my research looking at issues related to social justice, the philosophical foundations of human rights, and all of that sort of very abstract, theoretical literature. And then the reality of people is just so radically different. And I spent a lot of time looking at UN declarations, looking at how then they are transcribed into local laws and legislation, and still the experiences, the lived experiences of women, girls and boys is very, very different in terms of the continued and repeated violation of those rights.
Margaret, you have been spearheading gender budgeting in government, and you say the performance is dipping, and it's dipping because of funding. But surely this government has funding. The money is there, you know. And with gender budgeting, we don't even need new money. We can just work within the old money and reallocate the old money to promote gender equality. And unfortunately, and I want you to respond to this, when you talk to government about gender budgeting, especially the local governments, their understanding of gender budgeting is allocating some 500,000 for Women's Day celebrations, you know. And I know, Margaret, you have been in this for over 10 years. Why is it always remaining like that?
I think that our language as academics is the language to theorize so that the theories inform policy. But I think that when we go to talk to policymakers, then we should talk to them also in their language. And I think one of the essential things that we need is then to learn how to talk that language, how to communicate to other contexts. So I believe as gender institutions, not just in Uganda or globally, I think we need capacity building in how to do that.
Because we had just done research on gender budgeting and they didn't seem to know what gender was. They didn't seem to know how to implement also gender budgeting. And it was very exciting for us and also for them. One, it was a research that we had conducted at the national level, at the district level, and I remember you participated in that research as well. And he contributed quite a lot. And actually what came out of that is that the ministry wanted to work with us. They wanted us actually to continue and go back and present more of our research.
We speak very different languages. People who are in the academia, their language is so different from the language of people who are in government. And I think what really matters is how for us, now I'm on your side, how you people can actually learn the language that people speak on the other side. Because when you have these reports of yours and the way you present them and this academic language of yours, people on the other side are not impressed. And they don't take anything up. Because they want to see things which make sense to them. So I think what we have to learn is how do we communicate. For example, if you come into the Ministry of Finance, what kind of language should we say? Who are the people in that ministry? What are they professionally? Because you must speak in their language. If you're going to another ministry, what are they professionally? You must speak in their language. Because much as we all say, for us we are admissions, we are doing our work, we are publishing journals, so we get promoted, okay, fine. But if you want money from us, who are not publishing journals, and for us we have our own interests, you must do research which is relevant to us. So in that case, you also have to put your pride down and try to chase the pennies, where the money is, and try to do some of the research which we see as being relevant to us. So I think we must find some middle ground, all of us, in terms of saying, okay, what is the middle ground that we have to follow, and say that, okay, this will work and this will not work.
I'm very pleased to be here this afternoon to thank all of you for being here for these 3 days to discuss issues that are very critical to the development of Uganda, to development of women and gender studies as a discipline in Uganda and globally. And after the first day's presentations, Professor, we broke up into workshops, and those workshops were meant for us to critically think on those 3 themes and come up with challenges, with lessons learned, with best practices, and out of that come up with a way forward. What strategies? And so this afternoon we are going to have a short presentation from the 3 thematic areas, and that is going to focus on 10 key issues.
Presenting on behalf of Group 1, who are looking at advancing women in leadership. And based on our presentation yesterday, we came up with the following key issues. One is understanding of leadership, where we say that there's still lack of knowledge on what leadership actually is, and our action plans are to define our common goal and agree on how progress is to be measured. Then we also need to create models that can address the existing gender biases. Our next issue is limited resources for capacity building and growth, and we think this can be addressed through developing a strategy for resource mobilization. We also noticed that there is an issue of limited documentation or recognition of local case studies of women leaders, whereby we say much as women leaders are documenting their work and research, it is not being publicized. Some of us don't get to understand what is really happening. So we advise that we do thorough research and document experiences of women leaders, and also need to promote and celebrate the contribution of women leaders. Another key issue is young people express need for guidance and mentorship in spearheading gender equality. So we advise that we encourage rigorous processes of awareness creation, training, mentoring, and capacity building. These communication skills for students can be gotten through vigorously encouraging the students to engage into e-learning and incorporating short gender courses into our program. We also looked at lack of sufficient recognition of role models, whereby we say that in most cases we tend to look at the international models that are out there, yet we can also learn from the local models that we have here. And our point of action is to strengthen the gender scholarship and identify and facilitate the leadership skills. Our next issue was we noticed that there's a disconnection between the academia and the policymakers and practitioners, as we realized today in our earlier discussion. And we advise that we need to build more partnerships between the academia and policymakers, the private sector, and the practitioners, in order to engage more in action-oriented research think tanks. Our other point was limited visibility of the contribution of the School of Women and Gender Studies in the general public. And we advise that we need to increase visibility of the School of Women and Gender through use of the media, social networks, social clubs, and journals. We also looked at the gender policy in place, which we confirmed that we are happy that it's in place, but then there's a problem of implementation. For example, the representation of women in top management. So our advice was that we need to advocate for inclusion of women in the DVC positions. We also need to identify women who are sensitive to gender issues and mentor them into leadership positions. We also need to undertake advocacy with women activists in government, civil society, and the private sector on topical gender issues. That's the end of our presentation, and that we're able to come up with in the 3 days of this conference.
Strategic vision, the leadership that is shared through and operationalized was very important. And one of the short-term intervention, we realized that to revise and operationalize the strategic plan for the School of Women and Gender Studies, share the strategic plan and vision with internal and external stakeholders. Then the long term is test the vision through interaction with the society. Then the second key issue was sexist patriarchal resistance towards women and gender studies within and outside the university. And one of the short-term interventions included develop clear media messages on the relevance of women and gender studies, collaborate with gender reporters in media houses, confront resistance to gender head-on, develop a communication strategy to guide proactive engagement with various stakeholders who are pro and against women gender studies, was under human resource or staff motivation. And here we realize that building and sustaining a quality, dynamic, committed, and well-motivated staff was an issue. And one of the short-term interventions was building team ethos through regular staff interaction, Long-term is mentorship programs, apprenticeship. Then the fourth issue was research and theory construction. Here we realized the issue being lack of homegrown theory, develop a homegrown theory construction. So in the short term, we said that there is a need to collaborate with MISA, build South-South linkages, for instance, India, West Africa, prioritize African feminism in the teaching of feminist theory. First, understand the local context before you go Western feminist theories. Provide leadership in gender research wherever it is done, in and outside the university. Then long-term included, we need to go back to basics of how theory is constructed. Establish a research fund for theory construction. Engage in long-term research projects to help in theory construction. Organize seminars, symposia, conferences. Bring African feminist theories to deliberate on theory construction. Set a clear vision on constructing a homegrown theory in the next 15 years. Establish a research unit, do critical analysis and study of the programs. Inadequate synergy in the functionality and the relationship of the institution within the university system. And here short term was, we noted, ensure that 1/3 of university top management is female. Strengthening the synergy between Gender Mainstreaming Directorate and the School of Women and Gender Studies. Bring all aspects of teaching gender in the School of Women and Gender Studies. Long-term included, build a constituency across and beyond the university to support the advancement of women leaders within the university. There was inadequate monitoring and evaluation system within the institution. And here, short term, we proposed to hold regular brief meetings with the staff. Long term, we said develop an M&E strategy, collaborate with the International Council on Research for Women on M&E because they have a good M&E on that. Then the ninth issue included inadequate environmental scan and application to remain relevant as a need to identify champions of gender in partner organizations, doing relevant research and network with ministries, departments, and agencies, including CSOs. Lastly, there was disconnect between the institution and the women's movement out there. And here we suggested eliminate the disconnect between the academia and the women's movement, engage with women's movement, establish areas of research that women organizations are interested in. With that, we stop there. Thank you so much.
We identified. One was lack of commitments from parties. Our group looked at collaboration, and so we realized there is lack of commitment because the collaboration already exists, but there are no outcome of the collaboration. So the action we looked at is formalizing the collaborations through MOUs, because the MOU will put responsibility upon each and every party to take on their actions or to act upon what was agreed. The next was lack of awareness about the school and what the school is doing. So the action there we identified was to increase visibility and strengthen awareness of the relevancy of the school to the community, and especially to national development and prosperity. We suggested that what we are going to do is to use the mass media. We can use the website, and we use our students who have achieved. If we publicize the students, people will get to know that the school exists and is really doing something wonderful. The next issue that we identified was inactive research agenda. We realized the school already has a research agenda. How has it been worked upon? Is it active? So we realized we need to continuously review the research agenda that is in place and set an independent research agenda. so that we can continuously meet the current situations, not just relying on agendas that were made much before. We also identified lack of visibility and legitimacy. There we say the action is to undertake gender-conscious awakening programs, so that, and this we can do it at all levels of society. We can do it in the community, we can do it at schools. This is to make them know the relevancy of gender studies or the relevancy of gender, because we realize that gender kills the potential of human prosperity. There is also lack of grants. We could be having the interest in doing something, but the funding is not there. So we say the action that fits that is to set up a research coordination and grant office to devise ingenious clever raising of funds for research. So if there is a means we have developed to raise up research or to raise up funding, we find it will activate our research, outreaches, and scholarship will be provided to our students, and this will enable the research in the school continue. We also realize that there is weak relationship with other stakeholders. As a school we exist, but how are we relating with other people? Do we have a strong relationship? Because relationship is really crucial for the development of the school. So we say we should build skillful symbiotic relationships with the national and subnational political, cultural, religious, and other business partners. And that is to activate our research. We also say there is sort of stereotype. People have their mindset already. So how do we change this mindset of the people? If they're saying gender studies is not advantageous to anyone, if they're saying issues of gender is all about women, how do we get down with that kind of thinking? Say that we should continuously re-emphasize the relevancy of gender equality to the promotion of individuals' potentials, opportunities, and even access to resources and utilization of resources. Then another issue that we realized was lack of common identity. The school exists, but the staff within it, are they moving as one entity? It exists within a college. Is there one identity between the school and the college? But as a university, how are we moving on? So we need, as a school, as an institution, we say the action we need to foster an institutional identity and commonality of purpose amongst the staff and the institution. We should be known for something as a school, as a college, and as a university. There is also limited focus on area of inequality. Research done have always focused on household level. So few is done on education, health, matters that are there, but they are not elaborately done. Even when women activists are shouting, mostly we are looking at women at individual levels and household. So we are saying we should broaden the focus should broaden on other sectors. We should look at health as a whole, look at education as a whole, and all other sectors should be taken into consideration. Another issue we realized was too many foreign theories in our research. We are doing research, they tell you develop a theoretical framework. You're going for the Moser framework, you're going for, so many theories have come up. But does it make sense to other people who have not studied these theories? How about when you go to the community trying to tell them your findings and you're trying to explain to them those things? Do they understand? So we said we should at least generate Afrocentric South theoretical frameworks and methodological frameworks to do our research, so that when you're trying to present it to our leaders, they do know. In the morning we were talking about common language, speak their language. That is what this point is trying to emphasize. That is the end of our presentation. Thank you.
In a workshop of this kind, I am sure that many issues have been teased out as the summaries indicate. Independently, the summaries highlight points of commonality. I do notice issues of visibility coming up regularly in the three presentations. I also had issues of relevance and theory and documentation and networking playing out, I think you're spot on. Right now at Makerere University, it is not a secret that course reviews are being made because it was demanded by the visitor to the university, who is also the head of state of this country. I wonder which direction it is going to head. And of course, women and gender studies is implicated in that review. It is not my duty here and now to preempt discussion, but let me say that perhaps there is a point, this is a good point for reflection. A good point for reflection to highlight the importance of women and gender studies. Women's studies the world over was born out of struggles. This is not a secret. And from those struggles, over the years, over the decades, we here can learn from that history and make our struggle worthwhile. There are things to pick from the different experiences in different places. There are things that may also need not be taken in wholesale. The issue of theory has come up very importantly, so this is also an epistemological issue, and I think we need to reflect on this seriously. The women issue, as I did mention, how women's studies, gender studies emerged out of struggle. This struggle is not yet over. Probably it's a lifelong thing, but it changes over time. Universities too, the modern university, emerged out of the product of the Industrial Revolution. The 21st century university is not going to be like the 19th century university. And an African university like ours will be a university, but it will have certain peculiarities that define it separately from universities elsewhere. Which therefore also means, if I am not mistaken, that women and gender studies at Makerere University, for instance, is not going to replicate women's studies or women and gender studies in totality from elsewhere. I think there are points of commonality and there are points of differences which we need to appreciate, reflect on, and respect, even when we do not always agree. I would like to say, if I am not mistaken, being a student of literature, that the fate of women's studies is not very different from the fate of the humanities studies generally. Humanities, the African humanities is in a set of crisis. Some of the crisis is out of perhaps having taken things for granted in the past. Some of the crisis is imposed on the humanities from the outside. And I think it is our duty to fight for our place, because the issues of humanities studies is about issues of citizenship. Global citizenship, national citizenship, citizenship at different levels. And I do think that this is also the place of women's studies, gender studies. This is about rights, citizenship, obligation. And so I do urge you all, when you go back to your respective constituencies, both in Uganda here and to our guests who come from far-flung places, to reflect on this and to network in order that you join hands and struggle together. It is very difficult to fight in isolation. If you think that the problem that might be associated with women in gender studies at Makerere is an isolated thing, you will find that it will catch up with you in your other corner as well. So it is important to network, to collaborate, to share the joys and the sorrows, and to forge ways of moving ahead. I'm not going to make a very long speech. Let me say two things in conclusion. To our guests who have come from the different countries that the Dean highlighted, Kenya, India, Ireland, the United States, Zimbabwe, we thank you for coming to be with us. We wish you a safe journey, and I do think we should keep in touch, because the things that bring us together are many more than the things that keep us separate. To the Ugandan community, You have heard it all about the importance of networking, about linking the university to community, which also means linking community to universities. Issues of stereotyping were mentioned, and all these dilute the quality of the effort that women and gender studies at Makerere and the women's movement in different places have made. I think we need to work around that, and we need to work around that with a lot of zeal. Lastly, the question of homegrown theory. As a student of the humanities, I would like to balance that with, because we do not need to borrow everything from the outside, I agree with you, but we also need not become very parochial to the extent of dismissing everything that comes from the outside. As a university, we must be located in a particular history and geography, and we must also touch base with what happens elsewhere. For purposes of comparison, for purposes of growing from the different histories and experiences. I like to think this workshop came at a timely moment, and it came at a timely moment at two levels. One, I've already mentioned, the issue of the fate of the humanities, the fate of women and gender studies at Makerere University is an issue that is very much in the air. And so this is a good point for reflection and a good point for rallying together to see how best we can address these issues that niggle us all the time. And by way of conclusion, therefore, I'd like to thank you very much, the organizers and the participants, and to wish you a safe journey back to your respective places. And I'm sure that we are going to meet again very soon. I'd like now to declare this 3-day workshop officially closed. Thank you very much.